quickly unpack some of the things we saw both last week and this week regarding media coverage. Kind of an interesting thing to think about right off the top with this is the fact that the Iraq War, just in terms of technology, media personnel, and total reach in terms of worldwide audience, was probably the most covered war in human history. And yet, as you're seeing in this documentary, a lot of confusion, a lot of misinformation, so that coverage is not necessarily translating into actual knowledge. Why do you think that is? What were some of the things, either last week when we watched part one or in this part two segment, that might have stood out to you in terms of what some fundamental problems were with the coverage? Yeah.
Once newscasters got there, or reporters got there, they didn't realize how it would actually be. They didn't understand how it would be, so it was hard to convey it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's one. What else? Yeah.
The stations are more focused on sensationalizing the war for ratings and views rather than giving the audiences real information.
Yeah, she mentioned sensationalism. That's something we often see in media now as well. And we're so used to it, we don't even really notice it. I think one of the things that they pointed out was all the dramatic music under the headings and the fancy graphics when they're doing an Iraqi war segment. And when I thought about that, I said, yeah, remember we talked about media codes several weeks ago? There they are at work, trying to convey something to you. And I think about when I was growing up, when there was news coverage in terms of bulletins or special reports, they didn't have any of that. They just had a sign that said special report, no music, no anything, just information. But now it's packaged almost like a television series in terms of everything they throw into the mix. What else stood out in terms of some of the concepts, some of the problems? Yeah.
The fact that like the media coverage was used as like propaganda for the war, so it was a lot of it was just intended to convince like the American people that what we were doing was okay.
Yeah.
When in reality it really wasn't. A lot of what we did wasn't.
Yeah, the concept of propaganda, and I thought the last comment was interesting and a good one to end on, in that the speaker was talking about how depending on which part of the world you lived in, the messaging you received was completely different. And in the United States, it was much more a sense of we're all on the same team, most definitely, and not a lot of critical coverage. We saw that in part one as well, the run-up to the war, that there was this acceptance that what we were hearing from the government was absolutely correct. And major newspapers like the New York Times, the Washington Post, later on admitted that they dropped the ball in their coverage of this very important event that we are still dealing with to this day. Other thoughts about the media, things that maybe you saw that you did not know or surprised you somewhat? What do you think? Anything that you saw in terms of coverage, in terms of how you might have imagined the coverage, what war coverage is like, and what you saw that might have been different than what you would imagine yourselves? Anything? Yeah.
I was actually kind of surprised that journalists were allowed to go and be in the midst of the war with soldiers and like go up to them with a microphone and interview them while they were holding their gun.
Yeah. Now that's an interesting point. She's talking about the embedded soldiers and that being surprised that they were allowed to do that. What's interesting about that was that in actual fact, there was less independent reporting in the actual fields of war than in previous military actions. This had been a very common practice for journalists to be on the front lines and cover things in some very dangerous situations. There was for instance, a war correspondent during World War II named Ernie Pyle who traveled with the troops and eventually was killed by sniper fire in the South Pacific, but not before writing a series of stories humanizing the people who were fighting the war that, in journalistic circles anyway, are still recognized today as some of the most powerful writing to come out of war coverage. But what was interesting about what's happened now in the situation in the Iraq War was the in-bed concept, where basically, yeah, you're out there with the troops, but in a very limited way. There really wasn't a way for you to say, I want to go over here now. Essentially, you're with this group of people, and wherever they go, that's where you're going to go. And typically, at least from what I observed watching news reports at the time, I did not see a lot of embeds in with the actual heavy fighting unit, so to speak. They tended to be on the periphery, and I that could be coincidence, but I think there was some strategic planning in that. Yeah.
It seems like a lot more of the independent outlets were not part of news organizations. Like
Yeah.
They weren't like news-oriented companies.
Mhm.
Like a lot of things I've seen coming out of Iraq or even the Afghani war is like private documentaries,
Yeah.
like Restrepo or Korengal, where private groups of documentary makers go and
People not affiliated
Yeah,
with
the
conglomerates.
news station. And
Yeah.
They interview all the soldiers and everything there.
Yeah, and we saw examples of this too in terms of the real information-driven stories you didn't hear on network television type of stories. Were they coming from U.S. media outlets? No, they were coming from other countries typically, or from independent journalists who were traveling on their own. And I don't know if you recall from last week, but one of the key things that was brought up was that the system of coverage itself was somewhat corrupt, in that people had to, the networks were paying money to get their people in, so the more money a company had, the more of their people they could get in to Iraq to cover this. So it really was dominated, at least in the U.S., by corporate media, but again, from an information, from a revelation standpoint, we did not get near the information that other countries were seeing about what's going on behind the scenes. Like, that children's hospital is a classic example. That kind of footage did not hit U.S. airwaves till much, much later. It wasn't part of the narrative that everybody was being fed. Also, it's worth noting the set, the $1 million news set that they had set up. So the military obviously hired some very smart media people to create production value, to create a good-looking news set, just like you would see at NBC or CBS, and that their generals could speak from. And then, like they said, give them bits and pieces that would tend to dominate the day's news, as opposed to things actually happening out in the field. So it's really sobering when you think about it in terms of how much we rely on our media for information at a critical time, like a war, and to wonder how much of that information is accurate, how much of it has been vetted or verified, and it's something you definitely want to think about as we go forward, and hopefully no new wars, but as we hit crises in this country and around the world, think about these kind of things and think about who's covering, how could that coverage be managed. So this kind of segues a little bit into what we're going to discuss a little more fully today, which has to do with the politics of media, not just news media, but entertainment media, and how those two things intersect to create the kind of media environment, for instance, that we have in our country today. So let's start with, we've already talked about it, the First Amendment, which is the first real document that speaks to media in this country. Okay, what does the First Amendment say? Essentially, it says that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or the press, or the right of the people to peacefully assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. That's the First Amendment. And as I think we've mentioned before, it's no coincidence that was the First Amendment, because freedom of speech, freedom of the press were very important to our founding fathers. And we talked about this, the fact that they're coming from countries where there was a lot of persecution of free speech, and even within the colonies, If somebody was trying to speak out against an unfair tax or whatever, they could be faced with fines, jail time, any number of things. So this was a key thing. But now let's get inside the head of our founding fathers for a second, way back in 1781, and as they're working on the Constitution. Let's try to imagine if they could, when they're drafting the Constitution, do you think they could have conceived in any way, shape, or form of the media world we live in today? Even if you gave them the most powerful hallucinogenics on the planet, could they have come up with what we have today in our world? I would argue no. Remember, all they had was the printing press. And they're supposed to imagine this world where you can carry a world full of information in your pocket, and you can contact anybody in the world anytime with that. Yeah.
Going off of that, it's kind of interesting to see how, as technology started to develop a little bit, it's crazy how closely people were able to predict the development of technology. Like VR systems and touchscreen devices and like mobile PDAs and all this stuff. I think it's kind of interesting how they were able to predict all that.
Yeah, as you go forward and as technology does change and improve, people start saying, gee, what could happen next? And some things are wildly wrong, but other things were pretty accurate. And what I wanted to kind of say about all that is, what is this, if you could show our founding fathers the media world we live in today, what do you think their reaction would have been in terms of writing that First Amendment? Do you think it would have changed their thought process any? And this is all obviously speculative, but what do you think it would have done? Yeah.
I think they would have kept it. I don't know that they knew we were going to have TVs and a pocket full of information, but I feel like they probably figured there would be tensions one day in the media, and they were planning ahead for that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, obviously, yeah, freedom of speech was a premium for them. But again, some of the things that are going on now, they could not have even fathomed. And again, they were very much, as you mentioned, an opinion-based group of people. All their newspapers were opinion-based, so they didn't have a problem with any of that. Yeah.
I feel like they might have changed something in regards to media conglomerates being based around specific political parties, because many of the founding fathers were heavily against creating condensed political parties. Because I remember Washington actually said something about that in one of his addresses, to not create multiple political parties and then choose from these parties, and to just have individual candidates.
Yeah.
So I feel like they would have changed something in regards to conglomerates being focused on a party.
Yeah, and that's a whole interesting 5-hour side discussion in itself, isn't it? Because there are a lot of people that argue in the media world we live in today that it basically makes it virtually impossible for new parties to come into existence and to gain any traction, because they can't buy the media exposure that the major parties can. Because if you look at the history of this country, new parties were coming up all the time. When Abraham Lincoln was elected president, the Republican Party was a brand new party. So these kind of things have happened throughout history, but it doesn't seem to be able to be as viable in this day and age, because mass media has become so important in terms of getting the message out. So if we take the premise of the founding fathers believe in freedom of speech and probably would have, for the most part, supported that even with all these technologies, media technologies they could not imagine, then the question is, why are some media regulated and some aren't? Okay, in other words, newspapers are not regulated, other than they have to follow basic laws in terms of not libeling people. If they're found guilty of libel, obviously they pay a penalty for that. But in terms of what kind of opinions they can express and ideas, there is no censorship. Yet we do have, to a degree, censorship, for instance, in broadcasting. And this brings us to the discussion of the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission. Does anybody know how the FCC came about, or even when it came about? Okay. Well, the FCC was created in 1934, and it was in reaction to radio at that time. That was the only electronic media that it was really dealing with. And there was a sense that the public needed this regulatory agency to guide the radio industry. So you might ask yourself, well, wait a minute. How is this different than newspapers? Aren't radio broadcasts protected under the First Amendment as well? How can there be a regulatory agency? Well, it's very interesting how the FCC was created, okay? Because the premise of the FCC is that it was created to protect the public interest. And we'll come back to that in terms of what that means in a few minutes. But that was basically its charge initially, to protect the public interest. How did they create it, and how was it allowed to do this? And why? Well, first of all, let's talk about why they wanted to do this, why they want to have this agency to protect the public interest. We've talked about this in class before. How is radio different than a printed piece of information in terms of just the logistics, technology, and costs? Yeah.
When you're on radio, when you're like live, you don't have enough time to plan a lot of the time. So like if you're in a conversation live,
Yeah, that's one thing, live versus something that is created and prepared and put out there. And what about just what it takes to, granted, a lot of newspapers by the time radio was invented had massive printing rooms that they would put out thousands of editions of the newspapers on. But at its core, for you to put out information, printed information, what did you need? And people were still using these in the 1930s as well, not in big cities, but just a simple printing press, which you could afford. In some cases, you might have to take out a loan for it, but you could actually buy a printing press, one of those hand crank ones, make your own newspaper, distribute it. That happened a lot in smaller communities, okay? So everybody had access to it. Can you say the same thing about radio? And I mean commercial radio, that goes out over a wide geographic area. What are the kind of things you need for that? You need a place to broadcast from and all the equipment. You need a massive broadcasting tower to send out the signal. We're talking millions of dollars of equipment just to go on the air. Now, can the average person do that? Okay? No, they can't. So what occurred to government officials was really the only people who can afford to get into this new medium of radio are people with much deeper pockets than the average person. And there aren't going to be a lot of stations on the air. So how do we know that the rich and powerful are not going to take over this medium and say things and do things that have the desired end for them and are maybe not in the best interest of the public? So this was the concern. That's where in the public interest came from in terms of their charge, in terms of the charge of the FCC. So how did they legally get involved with that, though? Well, this is pretty interesting. What do you know? Nobody deals with an actual broadcast signal anymore, but maybe you know how it works. How does a broadcast signal work? What happens from point A to point B where you are receiving the broadcast signal? What happens in between? Where's the signal come from? Anybody? You know where? See, this shows you how much times have changed that nobody's really sure, okay? Because everybody would have known 30 years ago. Where do broadcast signals come from? Yeah. Antennas, and where do they go between that antenna to your home antenna where you receive it?
Well, it's in radio waves, like to a certain radius.
Yeah, they travel through the air, right? Through the airwaves, basically. right? Now, you've heard them say the airwaves, you know, like so-and-so dominating the airwaves. You've heard that expression. They still use it even though it's an antiquated expression, but it's still a term that's used, airwaves. So they go through the airwaves from point A to point B. Well, Congress decided essentially that, hey, who owns those airwaves? Who owns that space above us all? So can the companies own that? Well, no, yeah.
Isn't it like when you buy property, you can also buy air rights?
Not quite, I think. It's, no, I mean, you can, that's a whole nother thing where I think what you're talking about might be you buy like a certain, or not buy or license a certain signal, a certain place on the band, and a certain frequency. That is yours. But let's just talk about the air itself, the air above you. Who owns that? Who's that belong to? Anybody care to guess? Yeah.
The United States?
Yeah, it's within the United States, but does it belong to the government? Is that their air? I mean, I'd like to think it's my air too. I breathe it, right? This is my space. Well, this is what Congress decided. You know what? It does belong to all of us. It belongs to you. It belongs to me. It belongs to you. It belongs to everybody. It's the public's airwaves. So, if some company is going to send a signal through the public's airwaves, then we should be able to regulate how they use those airwaves. On behalf of you, we're going to regulate how those airwaves are used. Okay? I think that's kind of creative. A creative way to get into regulating media, to decide that this is something that belongs to you. You don't have the individual power to control what comes over that airwave, so we'll do it for you. Okay, we'll regulate those airwaves and make sure that everything sent over it is in the public interest. So now let's get to the third part of this equation, which is the term public interest. What does that term mean? What does it mean for something to be in the public interest? What's best for the public? Okay, that's pretty simple and pretty correct answer. Now, who can tell me what is best for the public? Yes.
The public.
Okay, so what is best for the public? You tell me, what's best for the public?
Anything that affects
Mm-hmm.
the public at home or, personally.
Sure. So give me an example, something that's,
Well, right, like from here.
anything.
Like there was a contamination in like local farms or
Mhm.
vegetables that we get produce from.
Yeah.
That would affect us.
Yeah, that would definitely be in the public interest. I would agree 100% with that. Now let's move it to a broadcast signal and a broadcast program. How do you decide that a program is in the public interest or not in the public interest? How do you do that? Can you do that? Yeah.
Well, like ratings.
Well, that's if the public is interested in it, yeah. So in a certain way, yeah, you can decide that they are interested in it. But if we use the term public interest in terms of what's best for the public, because as we've already discussed in this class, a lot of what the public is interested in media isn't necessarily what's best for them, is it? So if you're regulating the media, the broadcast media, how do you decide if something is proper content for the public or not? Is that a difficult thing? What do you think? What do you think of that? Anybody have a thought on how easy or hard that would be? Yeah. Exactly. Could we get Birmingham, Alabama, and San Francisco to agree 100% on what is proper television programming? Probably not. Do you think we could get everybody in this classroom to agree on what's proper television programming? I would argue probably not. So you see here the absolute perplexity of the situation that as the FCC is being created, they already have to defend something, to protect something that nobody can really clearly define, right? Add one more thing to the mix. Our public norms, our values, what we consider proper and improper, do you feel like they've changed in 2016 compared to, say, 1956? Yeah. So that's another thing too. We're always evolving. As a society, we're evolving. Things that were considered improper 10 years ago suddenly are okay now. That's part of the evolution of society process. So it makes it even more difficult for the FCC as a regulatory agency. But let's take a look at some of the things they had to struggle with in terms of television programming, for instance. I think I may have already used this example, but once the FCC was created, and again, it was created during the radio era, but obviously when television came into the mainstream in the late 40s, early 50s, that was also part of the FCC's regulatory duties. And they were so powerful in terms of the kind of fines they could levy and the fact that they could pull your license as a television operator, including networks. If you were CBS or NBC, for instance, at that time, and you put something on that the FCC would considered improper, you could have your license be put at risk for even being able to broadcast. So networks were very fearful of the FCC, and typically most networks had a censor or censors, people that were on their payroll that were there to make sure improper content did not go out over the airwaves. So the example I mentioned before was the I Love Lucy episode. The fact that when her character on the show became pregnant, they had to take the word pregnant out of the script because that was considered too risque for family viewing to say the word pregnant. Likewise, 10 years later, in the mid-'60s, when the sitcom I Dream of Jeannie premiered, and they had the main character dressed in what I would kind of describe as kind of like a belly dancer, costume, and her navel was exposed. The censors made her go back, and they made the network go back, and the show producers recut the outfit so that the hemline came above her navel, because it's not proper to see a woman's navel on television. Okay, think about those things, and then think about what you can see on television right now. A little bit different, isn't it? Okay, so this is some of the problems that have come up, and it just got more complicated as media technology changed. First with cable, and then with satellite, and then finally with the internet. Why do you suppose the creation of cable television complicated things in terms of rules and regulations and the Federal Communications Commission? Think about how I defined how they got into the business in the first place. Yeah.
Live coverage.
No, because they could do live coverage with broadcast signal. But what do we know about cable? What do we know about cable? How do you get, if you're on a cable system, how do you get your programming in your television? Anybody know that? Well, how does it physically get to your house? Not who's the source, but kind of like, remember we talked about broadcasting, it goes through the airwaves. How does cable get to your house? Does it go through the airwaves? Yeah, wiring. Yeah, so there's a cord. Yeah, it comes through wires. Okay, if you're on dish, that's a satellite situation, but it does not go through airwaves. The other thing about cable that's important versus broadcasting, there's a really important distinction, and we're going to see why it's important in a second, is that cable, if you're on a cable system, you have to pay for that. If you want to have free TV, you can still have free TV by going ahead and putting up your antenna on your house. You could still get a broadcast signal. Hardly anybody I know does that. All right, but you could do it. What's the implication if you are paying for a service versus a service that up until cable was free to anybody who had an antenna and went through the airwaves? Yeah. It is better in more channels, absolutely. But what are the legal implications? Can you still regulate it the same way? And if so, why? If not, why can't you regulate it the same way with the same restrictions that you could regulate broadcasting? Yeah.
Like HBO and stuff, the premium channels that you have to pay for, they can't be regulated as much because you are paying for the content,
Mhm.
and therefore you know the content you are purchasing.
Correct.
So they can't restrict the content that you are willingly purchasing for yourself.
Yeah. You are willingly purchasing it for yourself, and it's not coming through those airwaves that we all own. Okay? So there's no public ownership in how it's getting to you, and you are paying for the service. Yeah.
Quick interjection. Can you guys make sure your phones are away and you're paying attention? Because the next time you're in this room, we'll be taking a test. So you really need to pay attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. All right. So, if that's the case, if you have a situation where now you're paying for it, it changes the dynamics. Now, the FCC, as these new systems came on board, we're still in the business of licensing, still in the business of regulating in terms of who has licenses to do this. But can you tell me, if you watch a network television on ABC, CBS, Fox, if you watch on any of those channels, how is it different than shows you might watch on HBO? Can you see a clear difference in terms of content? What's the difference? What do you notice most of all? Yeah.
There's a lot more sexual content on HBO.
Yeah, language and
And
sexual,
violence.
yeah, and violence. Yeah, more graphic violence, more language, more sexual content than you can have on network. Now, you see more of those things, by the way, on broadcast television than you saw before. And even though you receive those broadcast channels through cable, by the way, they're still, they're still considered broadcast channels, which is why they're under a stricter guideline. But having said that, you will also notice that there is more swearing, for instance, maybe partial nudity, things like that, on network shows because societal norms have changed. And that's the thing that the FCC has always struggled with. There was a Supreme Court Chief Justice back in the 1970s. They were hearing an obscenity case before the Supreme Court, and he said during the proceedings, "I can't tell you what the definition of obscenity is, but I know it when I see it." And I thought, what a perfect quote, because that's kind of how we all feel, right? We know what's obscene to us. We know what offends us, but trying to define it for everybody is a very difficult thing because what offends me might not offend you and vice versa. So this is why it's such a treacherous ground to trod for the FCC to try to deal with this. But they do. Howard Stern, how many people are familiar with Howard Stern? Okay. Howard Stern used to be a regular receiver of FCC fines. His stations they worked for regularly got threatened with getting their licenses pulled. That stopped happening. Why did that stop happening? Yeah.
He has his own, show, his own, private thing now. Maybe I'm wrong on that.
Well, you're close, but not quite. Yeah.
Does he have his own podcast now?
He may have that as well, but what changed? What was the key thing that changed?
Didn't he move it to internet radio?
He did, yeah. He went to Sirius, okay? Which, again, service you pay for. It's not using your airwaves, and you pay for it. It's a specific service, and so, of course, then the fine stopped. Even though the FCC might still be in charge of granting their license, they do not regulate them the same way as they would a broadcast channel, yeah.
Does the FCC also regulate things like podcasts, or no, because we buy those?
No, they typically no, and we're going to get to FCC and internet in a few minutes because there are some interesting concepts that need to be discussed about that, because that's the new basically undiscovered country for the FCC in terms of how do we handle this thing. So we'll get to that in a second. But the point is that Howard Stern, by moving to a service that was not requiring the strict use of broadcast signals, suddenly moved away from getting fines. In some ways, it may have hurt him a little bit, I would argue, because he got a lot of press from getting fined all the time, and you don't see him as much anymore, just because he's in an environment where he can't generate as much controversy as he used to. The FCC has also tried to look at news and information too over the years. For instance, there was a document created by the FCC in 1949 called the Fairness Doctrine. Okay, anybody ever hear of the Fairness Doctrine? Because it does come up occasionally in classes, although I don't know how much it comes up in previous high school classes you've had, but it may have come up before. Anybody familiar with the Fairness Doctrine? Okay. Well, basically, the Fairness Doctrine was an attempt to ensure that all coverage of controversial issues by a broadcast station, initially radio, but then television, because television was just coming into the information business when the Fairness Doctrine was created, basically a way to make sure that there is a reasonable opportunity for discussion of the issues from contrasting points of view, and basically, to kind of put it in simple terms, making sure that broadcast entities were getting all sides of the story, instead of just saying, here's all the people that favor it and this is why they're right. If you interview candidate A, for instance, under the Fairness Doctrine, you needed to interview candidate B as well, because otherwise you could be fined. The thinking very much the same as why the FCC was created in the first place, that this is a powerful medium in the hands of a few rich and powerful entities, and we want to make sure that they're not driving the political or social agenda of the country, and that everybody is getting a fair shake. It's what people lived by in the broadcast industry for many years. During up through the early years of my career, it was the standard that all stations lived by. But what happened was, in the 80s, when cable now was very prevalent, and you now went from having 4 or 5 channels to dozens and dozens of channels, which doesn't sound like a lot now, but it was huge at the time. Once you moved into that spectrum, the FCC and the government in general decided to deregulate a little bit. And the thinking was, well, we don't have to worry about people having all sides represented anymore, because there are so many different channels. You can find all those viewpoints. You don't need everybody to provide both sides of the story. And so the Fairness Doctrine was thrown out during the 1980s, essentially. It was thrown out with all the deregulation that was going on at the time. What do you think of that? Do you think we would be better served to still have the Fairness Doctrine in place? Or do you agree that with all the media choices we have now, it's not really a necessary rule anymore? How do you feel about that as a concept? A rule or a regulation that requires you to look at multiple sides in a debate or an issue. Any thoughts? Good thing, bad thing? Don't care? What? Yeah.
I'm just surprised that they backed off. I thought that maybe with more officers out there that they would want to regulate more.
That they would what?
I thought they would want to regulate more.
Yeah. Yeah. What else?
I think a good reporter is unbiased, whether or not there's a fine that comes with it.
Mhm.
I think with regulations today, there's no need for another regulation, you know?
Mhm.
Because you can find both sides easily.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think you said something really key too, that there are still, as much as we like to, and we talked about this last week, point the finger at the media, and we obviously in this documentary is a lot of finger pointing at the media. But all that being said, I would still argue that most journalists I know anyway still try to live by the concepts espoused in the Fairness Doctrine, which is to provide all the sides of the story and provide a balanced report. So there is still that attempt to do that. Not so much in the cable news network world, obviously, but in terms of legitimate, journalistic organizations, you tend to find that that is still the case. One area we haven't talked about in terms of regulation and the politics of regulation that I think is also interesting to take a quick look at is the movie industry. All right, movie industry has had a really interesting regulatory history in this country. First of all, around the 1930s, movies had already been around at that point for about a decade and a half or so in terms of being a popular form of entertainment for people to take part in. So in the 1930s, there was concern that could some of these visual images be projecting certain unsavory things or suggestive things that were not good for families, were not good for America. So Congress came up with the Motion Picture Production Code, okay? This production code meant you applied for this, basically the seal of approval from the government that your film was decent family entertainment. And this is a code that was lived by for a good several decades. If you look at movies, I don't know how many of you watch old movies, but if you watch old movies from the 30s and the 40s and 50s, I would even argue, do you see a lot of content that you think, oh, geez, this would be inappropriate for kids? Or do you feel like, yeah, pretty much anybody could watch this? This is basically a product of the Motion Picture Production Code that was established in the 30s. But then something started to happen as you moved into the late 50s, early 60s. And some of you people who love film may realize this yourselves already, that filmmakers started to change. Filmmakers started to kind of push the envelope a little bit in terms of the kinds of movies they were making, the subject matters that they were tackling. And what was happening was, particularly this was going on in Europe with a lot of the European filmmakers, they were getting films out there that were talked about a great deal and were generating a lot of discussion in the film world. But in this country, they couldn't be shown, and if an American director tried to make a similar type of film, typically it would not receive this seal of approval and would not be shown. So this created a problem for people in the movie industry because they felt like, you know what, this really amounts to censorship. And nobody who works in any kind of artistic community likes the concept of censorship. So as they're pushing the envelope, though, they also recognize that there's a danger that the censorship is going to reach new heights, because there was talk in Congress and other places like maybe we need even tighter rules because now the subject matters are getting more intense and are changing, and we need to do something about that. So long story short, the movie industry in the mid to late 60s came up with a concept we would call self-regulation, meaning we don't want other people to regulate what we do. We want to have artistic expression and not have it censored and not feel this sting of censorship to the art we're trying to create. So therefore, we're going to come up with our own rating system, our own system in which people can learn, what's in the movie and can make their own decisions. And it turned out to be a wildly successful idea, because not only did the Motion Picture Production Code go away because of this, there really has never been any talk of censorship in regard to the movie industry again in any serious way. And how it started essentially was with a series of simple codes that have been adapted over the years. The original motion picture codes were, I believe, G, M, R, and X. Just 4 different ratings, simple as that. G, we still all know, that's the one that has existed through the years. It means it's good for anybody. M later on got replaced by PG. M stood for mature audiences. People weren't really sure what that meant, so they changed it to parental guidance suggested, or PG. R, restricted, as it still is today. And X meant that no one under 18 could see it. Now, as the code developed, this code the movie industry created for itself, there were problems and there were variations and things they did to try to make it more clear. For instance, the X was a real problem because some films, when they got tagged X, when I say X, what do you think of in first thought? What's that?
No.
But I mean, what? Yeah, no. But I mean, what kind of movie? What kind of movie? Huh?
Yeah.
Huh? Pornographic, yeah. That's the first thing that pops into your head is pornographic films, right? Okay. A lot of the movies getting tagged with the X rating in the 60s, in the late 60s, early 70s, were not pornographic at all. In fact, one was an Oscar winner, Midnight Cowboy, which was rated X when it came out. They've since re-rated it because, as I mentioned, societal norms change. And now if you watch it, you go, yeah, that's probably an R, but barely an R, I would argue. But that's what changing times do. But they realized that certain movies were really great movies, but maybe the content was very adult, and I don't want that tag that people think this is some kind of pornographic movie. So filmmakers argued for a new rating, which became NC-17, and that rating establishes itself from the X negative connotations, and this just means you have to be 18 or over to see it, but it also indicates it's not a pornographic film. All right, so that's one thing that happened. Another thing that happened was in those middle ratings, PG for instance. You know, of course, the rating we have now, PG-13. That was created because of an Indiana Jones movie. Have you all seen the Indiana Jones movies? I assume you would have all seen them at this point. Okay, the second one, Temple of Doom, which was rated PG. So moms took her little kids to see Temple of Doom, little Johnny and little Mary. They went to the movie theater, and then they watched this high priest reach in some guy's chest and pull his burning heart out of his chest. Little Mary and little Johnny freaked out. And then the parent was very upset, started writing and calling movie studios saying, this is an outrage. PG, I should be able to take my little kids to this and not see people get their heart taken out of their chest, all right? So movie studios said, okay, well, that PG is kind of broad, so maybe we need to break that into two categories. Your basic PG, which is for mild violence or language, and then PG-13, meaning some of the thematic elements might be a little more intense. And so in the wake of Temple of Doom, they created that PG-13 rating. So what do they do today? What is the most recent add-ons to the rating system, which actually are my favorite of all the things they've ever done to modify the rating systems? What have been the most recent add-ons to the rating systems in terms of what they provide the consumer? Anybody think of that? Do you have your hand up?
Isn't there not rated?
Huh?
Just unrated?
Well, there is that too. Yeah, if something hasn't had a chance to go before the ratings board, they will tell you that as well. And sometimes that means something, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's not, there isn't anything inappropriate, it just never went. Sometimes there is things that might be inappropriate for some ages. But in terms of helping you make a decision, what is the key thing? Yeah.
It says what type of stuff is in the movie, like drugs or violence or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. Contains violence, nudity, sexual situations, and they list the things that it has, which is way more helpful. I especially think that as a parent, because I want to know why it's rated this and how that applies to the child I'm trying to make a decision for. So I think that's been a real help. I also love some of the descriptions too, like in a Star Wars movie, rated for science fiction violence, sci-fi violence, I think they call it. I go, what's sci-fi violence? Okay, I didn't know that was a thing. Okay, but apparently that's different than regular violence. So you have these little variations that help you decide what's going on with a movie. But the key takeaway from all of this, of course, is that the movie industry, in an effort to avoid the politics of regulation, created a regulation system of its own that it controlled, that basically kept the government out, took the government out and kept them out of the movie industry. And that's a really key thing to remember. Now, the FCC, as you might guess, because there are so many options for entertainment and both in terms of cable and satellite systems, and now the internet, has become in a lot of ways a lot less relevant than it was at one time, because what are they supposed to regulate? Other than handing out licenses, what are they supposed to regulate at this point? Because, to be quite honest, there are so many areas they can't regulate that you can easily access, that they, in certain ways you could argue they've become a toothless tiger. But they are still there, and they are still making important decisions. One situation that's really critical that they've been very involved within is the internet and net neutrality. Now, who knows what net neutrality is? Who can give me a definition? Yeah.
Net neutrality is well, I would say basically, there's no like service that can get like I'm trying to explain.
Yeah, it is. It is hard to explain. I agree with you. Let me just kind of go ahead. Yeah.
Isn't it no organization can take control of or restrict the access of the internet to any
Yeah,
other provider?
you're both really close with that. Yeah, you're definitely very close to an answer to this. But I completely agree. Net neutrality is one of those things that's very difficult to explain. Essentially what it is, it's the principle that internet service providers and governments regulating the internet should treat all data on the internet the same, not discriminating or changing differentially by user, content, website, platform, application, type of attached equipment, or mode of communication. That's the basic definition. Does that still sound confusing to you? Yeah, absolutely. And I had a feeling it would, so that's why I have a clip queued up from about 2 years ago that I thought did a better job than anything I've ever seen explaining the net neutrality issue. This was done on the eve of a major decision that the FCC faced regarding the issue of net neutrality. So do you understand net neutrality a little better now? Hopefully you do. And there's an interesting epilogue to this in that the day after this show aired, the FCC's online comments section was so flooded with comments that it crashed the system. So John Oliver apparently does have some reach. And because it crashed the system, it generated a whole bunch of stories about the whole net neutrality decision that was before the FCC. So suddenly, because of a little bit of comedy on a cable program, it actually became a wider covered news story, the end result being that in February of 2015, the FCC ruled in favor of net neutrality and against the two-tier system they were going to put in. That was followed up by the cable companies filing a lawsuit challenging that decision, but then the rule ended up taking effect in the summer of 2015 after a court upheld that ruling was correct. So we do not have a two-tiered system, possibly because of John Oliver. He certainly played a role in it, but it shows you why it's important in terms of you being able to do what you want, on the internet and have the same kind of playing field that companies and corporations and cable providers, as you mentioned, have. So the only other thing I want to mention too is that I'm going to pass out the study guide now, and we're going to walk through this really quickly after everybody gets a copy. I'll send half down this way. So give a few minutes for all this to come through here. Okay, so one of the things I did not get a chance to talk about in detail today, which would be as mentioned on the study guide you're about to get, is the 1996 Telecommunications Act, which was an effort by Congress to address the problem of media monopolies or dangers of monopolies happening and try to make things a more competitive playing field. Instead of trying to explain that all in 2 minutes, I'll just mention, and it's mentioned in this part of the study guide, that the information on what that Telecommunications Act attempted to do for media ownership and how it turned out is in Chapter 3 of your textbook. So just be aware of that, because you might see that and think, oh, I don't remember talking about that in class, because we really did not. All right. I'll wait a few more minutes. I think we're almost getting there. A couple more rows to go, looks like. Yes?
I'm sorry, could you repeat which thing you said that we didn't discuss in class?
That's essay question on the essay part on the second page, number 3.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. Yes?
You said we don't need to get a Scantron?
Correct. No scantrons are needed for this. Okay. Almost there. All right, so to see a few more people are getting their exams now. So this exam is going to happen on October 6th. It's going to be a combination of a timeline, true, false, multiple choice, and short essay questions. It's based on materials from our assigned articles, our Media Society textbook chapters 1 through 4, class viewings like the documentary we just saw, and class lectures. You just need a pencil or pen to take the exam, and you'll be given 60 minutes to complete it. So let me kind of break down the different parts of it. The first part is a timeline. I felt like it's important to, because we talked about briefly over a couple periods the history of the internet and, not the internet, I'm sorry, the history of communication. And so I thought it was good to have a timeline of some of the really critical moments in communication history, some of which we talked about in class. And they're ordered on your study guide 1 through 20 in the order that they happened. When you get the exam next week, they will be on that exam, only not in this order. Your job will be to renumber them 1 through 20 in terms of the order these things happened. Okay, does that make sense? All right. Next on the list is you will be asked to define 6 terms. These are terms that we've used in class, some of which we've used for the first time today. Just short answers in terms of what they mean, and make sure they're in relationship to this class. For instance, the first term on there, codes. Obviously, if you look codes up in the dictionary, you're going to get multiple definitions for what a code is. I don't want the definition that's in the dictionary, and believe me, people have used that as an answer before. I want the definition of codes as we discussed it in this class in terms of nonverbal communication. That's what we're looking for. So look through all of these terms through the prism of our media discussions. Yeah? What's that?
Sentences for each one.
That's just a rough guide, by the way. I get asked that one a lot. Well, do you really, if I don't have this many sentences, am I going to get marked down? The sentence lengths are basically a rough guide to help you kind of gauge a difference between a short answer and an essay question. Some people are very good at explaining something in 2 sentences. If you're one of those people and you feel like it's clear what this means by my answer and you feel good about it, you're probably going to be okay. Yeah?
Will you get to pick the 6 we defined?
That's what I was just, no. That was my next thing I was just going to say, was I've given you 10 terms here. You're going to be asked to answer 6 of them. Okay? What I typically do, and I'll probably do on this exam, is I will probably provide 7 terms on the exam. You'll be asked to answer 6. Okay? So that's typically what I do. Same thing with the essay questions. I'm going to ask you to answer 2 of the essay questions. The essay questions will come from this list of 5, and I'll probably put 3 on the exam, but you'll only be asked to answer 2. Okay, does that make sense? All right. So another final thing to say about this, typically my study guides cover approximately 60% of the total exam. But in this case, because I have the added feature of the historic communication events timeline, it is actually, this study guide accounts for 80% of the exam. So if you are absolutely great at preparing for this exam, you should get no lower than 80% on it, because you've know all these terms, you know the essay questions, you know what order these go in. Typically, again, it will be 60, but for this one, it's 80. The final 20% will be the multiple choice, true, false questions. And again, those could come from readings or class discussions. And a lot of times the class discussion does mirror some of the key points in the chapter readings, for instance. So that's where it could come from. I could ask a question about the parts of weapons of mass deception that we just watched. I might have a question about that as an example. So all of that's fair game. I should also note that I'm not the type of person that tries to find the most obscure piece of information from the chapter I can to try to trick you. They'll usually be dealing with, on the true, false, multiple choice, broader points or concepts that were introduced. Yeah. Oh, just stretching? All right. Any other questions? Yes?
So the short essay, it's not a full essay, it's just all the ways.
Typically, what it will be, think in terms, unless you write overly large, think in terms of about half a page. I'll have one essay question at the top of the page and one in the middle. Fill it up. In some cases, you may need to write on the back, again, depending on how large you write, depending on how detailed you want to be in your answer. I would try to lean toward detail on the essays just in terms of making sure that you've completely answered the question and that you've covered the key points, yeah.
Okay, so should we prepare up to chapter 5?
What's that?
Should we read up to chapter 5?
Yeah, not yet. Yeah, through chapter 4, yes. Through chapter 4, and then the articles that early in the semester that I had you read as well. Okay, any other questions? All right, well, if you think of anything, I do have office hours next week on Monday. Yeah, I do have office hours on Monday. I actually am going to be out of town next Thursday, so I won't be able to be seeing anybody for office hours that day, and in fact, our brilliant peer mentors will be proctoring the exam on Thursday. But I just want you to know that if you have a question, feel free to email me if you can't make my office hours, yeah.
Will the exam start at like the normal time?
Yes, the exam will start at the normal time at 1 o'clock, and when you're finished, you will be done for the day. That will be it. Okay, anything else? All right, well, good luck, and again, if you have any other questions, feel free to contact me.